All right, everybody, welcome back. This is a continuation of Unit 2. This is topic 2.3, which is titled Island Biogeography, or the Theory of Island Biogeography. I'm also going to include in these notes today a concept called fragmentation of habitats, and it just kind of continues with our theme in this unit of biodiversity and how biodiversity can be affected if habitats or if ecosystems change. So let's kind of just get right into this. I think the theory of island biogeography is actually kind of an easy one. Where can I put myself at? I'll put myself up. Yeah, over here, I guess. Okay. Um, Basically, what this is referring to, this particular theory, is let's say, for example, you have a large area of land, say a coastal region. It could be anywhere. It could be in Florida. It could be off the coast of Africa. It could be in Japan. It could be anywhere. It says here occasionally natural or anthropogenic, we can't forget what that word means, right? Human caused disruptions on the mainland areas can cause animal migrations to nearby islands. So, I mean, that kind of makes sense. Let's just pretend that on the mainland here, I don't know, a baseball stadium gets built or something, or some large construction project which disperses a whole bunch of animals. And those animals no longer have their homes because their habitat has been lost. So they, can either, I guess, move somewhere else on the mainland. I guess that might be an option for them. Or they can possibly migrate to nearby islands. Hence it's island migration, right? So the theory, there's kind of two parts to it. So let's say that we have these two islands out here, right? We have this one here, that's kind of close to the mainland. Then we have island number two, which is a little bit further away. This kind of makes sense. It says the closer the island is to the mainland, the more likely it is to be populated by migrant species. So let's say these arrows are all just different migrant species of birds or butterflies or whatever they are. The closer that island is, the more likely those species are going to migrate to it. I think that kind of makes sense. I mean, if the island is really far away, I mean, I guess the birds can maybe fly there, I suppose, but they probably would fly to a closer island first before they flew to a further island. Now, along the same lines, here we have another kind of example of this. But here we have these two islands that are both about equal distance from the mainland. So again, let's say we have the same type of disruption and it causes these species to migrate. This says that the larger the island, the more likely it is to be populated by a migrant species. So again, if these two islands are similar distances away, the larger one will most likely be the one where more species will migrate to just because of its sheer size, right? So kind of to summarize this, the closer the island is to the mainland and the larger it is, the more likely species are going to migrate to it. I think that hopefully makes some sense. So here we have on this slide here, we have a group of islands. Okay, so here instead of two islands, we've got like what, seven islands. And here's our mainland. So imagine that there's some type of disruption going on. There's some kind of habitat disruption that causes species to migrate away to all of these islands out here. Okay, so here's my first question. It says, which island would be the most diverse? Another way to say that is which island, would most of these migrant species go to? So again, if you kind of go back to the theory of, biogeography, island biogeography, you got to look at the closer islands, right? So it looks like we've got these two islands here, A and B, that are both kind of the closest ones to the mainland. But again, remember, it's not just how close it is, it's also how big it is. So I would probably say that, island B would end up being the one that has the most biodiversity. It's the most diverse because that's where most of those species would migrate to. I'm not saying that species can't migrate to island A or C or any of these other ones, but since this one is the largest and it's the closest, it would be the one where most of those species would go. Now, which island would be the least diverse? So now we look at the islands a little bit further away, right? So again, the farther away it is, and the smaller it is, most likely that's where species would be least likely to migrate. So probably this little tiny island out here, Island G, this guy would probably be the one that has the least biodiversity because that's where the species would migrate the least, right? So again, that's just the theory. So again, large islands close to the mainland will have a larger richness of species. So that's more likely to impact biodiversity than all those other islands would be. So hopefully, again, that makes some sense. All right, so let's kind of shift gears a little bit to instead of islands like out in the middle of the ocean, let's take a look at terrestrial land. We can actually get um, sort of like islands that kind of form on land um, due to a lot of anthropogenic activities. It says here habitat fragmentation is the division of a habitat into increasingly smaller and more isolated pieces. So, kind of like little islands. I mean, look at this picture here in the middle, right? We've got, probably at one time this was all forested land, but now, since a lot of that forest has been cut down, we're left with these little patches of forest. So it's almost like they're these little terrestrial islands, kind of like in the middle of where a forest used to be. So, we can actually kind of apply this theory of island biogeography, a little bit at least to terrestrial fragmentation as well. Now, what can cause all this fragmentation? A lot of things, and we're going to talk about a lot of this stuff throughout the year. We'll talk all about like mining, for example, and agriculture, and oil and gas pipelines, and dam construction. But I mean, these are all kind of some major causes of terrestrial fragmentation. Deforestation being a really big one that you see here in this picture. Road construction, we see this down here at the bottom. This road going right through the middle of this forested area is a way to fragment or make one big area into two smaller areas. A railroad. I'm not saying this elephant would have any problems crossing the railroad, but maybe a lot of smaller organisms, this would be a much bigger distance for them to travel. So again, lots of things can cause this terrestrial fragmentation. So again, kind of like island biogeography, the smaller and more isolated the habitat is, the less biodiversity is going to be present. Here's a really good example of this that I really like. This is a good picture. So over here on the left, we have this one large area. And before I kind of get into the fragmentation part of it, I want to sort of define a couple of these areas that are in the picture. So this kind of dark green area, okay, that area there is what we call the core habitat. This is, let's say that this is a forest, for example. Okay, so this is like the major part of the forest. A lot of organisms live in there. You can probably get a nice variety of organisms that live in there. Probably get some animals higher up on the food chain. You probably get some animals a bit lower on the food chain, but biodiversity is probably pretty high in there. That's that inner habitat. Now, this kind of lighter green area, this is what we call the edge habitat. The edge habitat surrounds the core, and this is the area, this edge habitat that will be, near another habitat. There might be another habitat over here, or wherever it is, but that edge is kind of the outskirts of the entire habitat. And again, there's some different types of organisms that live out there as well. Again, ranging from herbivores to carnivores, whatever. But now, if you look what happened, we've fragmented it, right? We've kind of built a road right through the middle of it. So a few things I want you to notice that have kind of changed about this habitat. One, if you look at this kind of darker green area, we've split it into two green areas. And you'll notice how those green areas are a little bit smaller than what they were before. So now instead of having one habitat, we now have two, and the amount of core habitat has been reduced. And you'll notice, for example, over here, we have these four species, that were living inside of this core, whatever this species is here, probably some carnivorous cat or something. And maybe this one down here was a different species, and maybe some type of a bird, maybe like a deer or moose or something. But now, if you'll notice, because that habitat's been fragmented, some of those species are no longer there. And it's usually the higher level species, like your apex predators, they get impacted the most by this. So you'll notice, like in that core habitat, we don't have any more of those predatorial cats. They're just no longer there. I mean, they need big areas to roam, and they're just no longer present. So biodiversity has been impacted. You don't see much of an effect around the edges. You still see a lot of those organisms around the edges, so there's less of an impact on that. But there definitely is a pretty big impact on the core species and the amount of core habitat that we have. So again, kind of the results of fragmentation. Number one, it splits habitats. So imagine this is our big, original habitat here, and imagine that it's been fragmented either through roads or deforestation or whatever. So we're splitting that core into a lot of smaller pieces. Now you may even have the same area of core. If you like took the areas of all these core pieces and added them up, maybe it's the same as it is here. But usually that amount is reduced. But even if you do have the same amount of area, you've reduced each piece to a much smaller size compared to what it was before. So this is going to reduce your interior, your core species. It's going to probably cause them to struggle quite a bit. Another thing that's going to probably cause to happen is an increase of edge habitats. So even though we've kind of decreased the core, you'll notice how much extra edge we have. If we added up all the edge area here, it probably would be more than what we have over here. So the edge habitats would be increased, and that would probably increase our edge species. So the edge species would probably not be impacted as much as those core species would be. But again, this is just kind of the result of fragmentation. Another problem that we see when we reduce the size of a habitat through fragmentation is something called the edge effect. So imagine, for example, we have this kind of square patch of land. Let's say this is a habitat, and then kind of the orange area here is kind of the edge. What's out here, and usually around the edges of the habitat, you'll most likely have a lot of anthropogenic activity. You might have whatever roads maybe out there. You might have houses, or you might have just neighborhoods or whatever, right? So let's say that we have a house here. Let's say this family lives, on the edge of this forest, and they do whatever they do. I'm sure that they produce waste in their home, and I'm sure that their kids go out and play in the forest and whatever. I mean, I'm sure that their dog probably goes for a walk and urinates on a tree or something. But let's just say, and I'm not, this is kind of use this example. Let's just say that there's a forest fire. Let's say that this family, I don't know, let's say they're out having a barbecue or something, and I don't know, or maybe they're lighting off fireworks on the 4th of July and something goes wrong and there's a forest fire. Well, let's say whatever, the forest burns for whatever, an hour or two, and the fire department eventually puts it out. But there's a certain chunk of that forest that may have been destroyed or may have been burned down. Now, this large area here, that forest fire may minimally impact it. Maybe just this little corner of the forest was disrupted. But imagine if this habitat was fragmented and it became much smaller. So now we have just a chunk of this original habitat. So this is the same house. This is the same edge that's around the habitat, but the habitat is much smaller because it's been reduced by fragmentation. So now imagine if there's a forest fire. And I mean, just think about, maybe it's the same size fire that we had before, but it's going to probably burn down, much larger percentage of this forest compared to what it was before, all because the area is a lot smaller. Imagine if we fragment it even more, how much area that fire is going to take up. Imagine if we fragment it even more, it might burn down the entire area, right? So the edge effect, basically is the impact that activities on the edge, have on the interior core. And the smaller the core is, the bigger the impact the edge effect is going to be, right? So, forest fire is, I think, a pretty good example of that. But it could be any anthropogenic activity. It could be pollution or, anything else like that. So there's a couple things I guess that we can do. I always like to talk about some things that people can do, or that we can do to maybe help minimize the impact of fragmentation. Here's a really great example. It's called a wildlife corridor. So imagine here you have this big, whatever, 4-lane highway or whatever it is, split right down the middle of this habitat that was once connected. Now it's probably really difficult for some animals to get across that road without being, hit by a semi truck and becoming roadkill. But notice what they did here. They built this bridge that literally is just a natural land bridge, where animals can cross it, not have to worry about, getting hit by cars. And that can maybe help reduce the impact that fragmentation has on this entire habitat. Another one here, one of my favorites, this is called a fish ladder. Imagine there's a big dam built in the middle of a river. And the river flows, right? It flows in one direction. So imagine, you're a fish and you're trying to swim downstream or upstream. If you're a salmon, for example, they swim upstream to breed. And all of a sudden you get to this barrier, this big, concrete dam, and you can't go any further. So that's a problem for fish species. So I'm talking about fragmentation of a habitat. You literally are cutting the river in half and not allowing species to get to each other, right? So what they did was they built these fish ladders where literally, fish will swim up the ladder. If they're salmon, for example, they swim upstream. They will actually jump these steps all the way up this ladder and then get to the other side, and they'll just jump all over into the water on the other side of the dam and continue their journey to where they want to go. So again, this is just something. It seems kind of minimal, but I mean, it really has helped a lot of species of fish, get across these barriers that humans have created. So anyway, so make sure we know again what fragmentation is, our theory of island biogeography, and I'm going to finish up the lecture here. So have a good day, guys, and I will see you soon.